introduce yourself and we can start the conversation.
Great, sure. Thanks, Simon. Great to be on this webinar. Yes, for those who don't know me, I'm Caroline Gabriel. I've been an analyst looking at mobile networks, particularly small cells, for about over 20 years now, and I work very closely with the forum, heading up content and research in various areas. We actually did produce a sort of special report to accompany the event in Saudi Arabia. So some of the data and trends that we identified there, we'll share some of that today.
Yeah, I guess the key point for me was when we started the beginning of last year, and you were doing the analysis, as we typically publish the forum's market research, Caroline, don't we, sort of middle of the year.
Yeah.
And there was you do include the Middle East in that analysis, and have done for a while, and it's a relatively low volume globally. On a global scale, it's a relatively low volume. So I think naturally, perhaps one would assume that it's a small volume. So perhaps from a small cell perspective, you need to focus on other markets. But actually, as we went through last year and saw a lot of announcements coming out from the Middle East, in particular from Saudi, I mean, that switched us on within the forum to dig a little bit deeper below the numbers and to look at not just the addressable market size, but some other interesting trends that were happening there. But I think it's worth us just having a look from your perspective on the analysis and where you see how you saw the trends, how you see the trends at the moment in the market, and then we can sort of lead in from that into a discussion around. I guess I would chunk the conversation up into three parts. There's the build up to the Small Cell World Summit that we had in November, in terms of the initial indicators of what started to draw us in. There's a wider context which I'll talk about around we were co-located as a conference with a conference that was an inaugural conference like us in the region, which was interesting, and then some dip into some of the notable content at the SCWS in Saudi, which I think is worth noting. So perhaps, Caroline, if we just pick up your thoughts on the market analysis first.
Yeah, sure. I'll share just a couple of slides, if I may, Simon, and work. Yes, great. So just a few thoughts, which, as Simon said, we produce. My team produces a market status report and forecast each year about mid-year, and that is always broken out by region. So we do have sort of top-level figures for Middle East and North Africa, but we also did some more specific work because of the interest in that region, and particularly the event that Simon will talk about. So we drilled into a little more depth in terms of drawing out responses to our operator survey, which is a key input to the forecast, from operators and other deployers of small cells in that region. So just sharing a little bit of the trend. So this is the overall forecast. Now, forecasts are volume forecasts. So here we talk about radio units, which is either integrated small cells, radio units in a disaggregated small cell, or a DAS unit. But so you can see that there's sort of steady growth. In fact, deployment growth over this period from 2022 to 30 in MENA does slightly outpace the global average. And I'm sure we'll get into why that is, and particularly up to 2026, as in quite a lot of the regions, we see a sort of flattening at that point, and then another uptick in the last years of the decade as we see new architectures coming along, and also some of the countries that at the minute are not driving growth sort of coming up behind. So as you said, Simon, these aren't massive numbers, and we're looking at going from about 250k to just about 460k in terms of radio units. But I think there are two things that are important about this region. I think one is that It's been particularly in the Gulf countries, with Saudi Arabia, of course, being the largest. We do see these as centres of innovation, both in technology, but also in deployment models. And I know we'll talk quite a bit more about sort of neutral host models and also private industries. And a lot of the countries in this region tie in infrastructure development and schemes very tightly into very advanced digital programs. So there's quite advanced thinking. And that leads to the second point, which is that a lot of the players in this market, and particularly the large mobile operators, are part of bigger groups or bigger associations. And we see, often Gulf countries in particular, or their cities being used as test beds for approaches that are then implemented elsewhere, and often in sub-Saharan Africa, which of course tends to be a little behind, but is potentially a very massive market in future. So I think MENA punches above its weight in terms of the importance of what's going on in that region, and there is some global influence. But of course, as with all regions, we talk about them as if they're very consistent, but in fact, MENA is extremely varied in terms of the countries. So very different operating conditions in different parts. Say we've got at one end of the spectrum, you've got the GCC, very advanced in terms of communication infrastructure. Some of the North African countries are economically more challenged at the minute and don't have quite the same approach to building out infrastructure, but can learn from their neighbours. So these points we've taken from talking to quite a lot of stakeholders, operators, deployers, and vendors. On the left are what we see as the real sort of strengths that are driving growth for small cells in this region. GCC, particularly Saudi Arabia, has several neutral host players, and as anyone involved in the forum will know, we believe that to be essential for scaling up markets and giving choice and diversity of the types of investment that's going into small cell infrastructure. As I said, a lot of governments and individual cities in this region have very advanced digital and industrial agendas, and small cells are vital to many of those. Because of that, both governments and private sector are prepared to make quite large-scale investments in infrastructure, not just in the Gulf. We see that in Egypt, for instance. There are industry programs that are driving for better communication. By their nature, many of these very small cell focus: agriculture, shipping, oil and gas. There are others, but these particularly strong industrial sectors in this region that are looking to build a new generation of communication infrastructure. And there are some emerging opportunities, convergence with satellite for coverage and for some of the industrial and IoT applications, the huge build out of sports venues and sports facilities in several countries such as Saudi Arabia. Obviously, venues are always a very interesting way to innovate and to test very dense network conditions. But on the right, there are, on the right are some of the challenges in this market. We know that there's political and environmental instability in some areas that may discourage investment, particularly looking for funding from outside the region. Outside GCC, which has quite a sort of common approach, we see sort of fairly limited common purpose or common investment frameworks that would span the wider MENA region and bring in the maximum volume for vendors and deployers. There are still a lot of regulatory and bureaucratic hurdles that may limit access to spectrum, access to city infrastructure, and generally be a bit of a barrier to new deployment models. And of course, in some countries in the region, the deployment of macro networks, 5G and even 4G, is still immature. So we're not seeing a sort of capacity crunch that would make densification absolutely essential. And in most areas outside of the Gulf, we think small cells will be driven more by industrial or rural programs rather than by the classic requirement to deliver more capacity.
Yeah, I mean, there's Can I
Yes.
dwell on that? I mean, just we will. These are all very good points because they do come out when I talk through the journey that we went on. But one area that I was looking at this, you picked out that last point around the maturing of the macro network and what's going to drive the small cell thinking. And you're right. I think that although of course there are some cities, and Riyadh was hosting SCWS, and there'll be maybe some capacity crunch there, but what was noticeable, I think, around the always interesting as a small cell geek is to look at the architecture, the built environment. And what was very noticeable for me there was quite nice straight roads, gave an impression of quite a well-planned built environment with quite wide streets. And I could see quite a lot of the macro sites were located on, the rooftops were there aplenty.
Yes.
So you could get the canyon effect from a rooftop macro-like deployment looking down into these relatively long streets to give you coverage. So always for me, as I go to these places and think about the opportunity for small cell. So I agree that that's an interesting dynamic there. The one thing I will pick up though, and I will come back onto it again, was there's a very strong messaging in the conference around sharing of infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
So it was quite clear that government, ministry, operator, so regulator perspectives were that we need to be thinking about sharing architectures that are appropriate for sharing from day one. Maybe each individual operator deploying their own equipment from day one. Okay, but we're now in the sharing era, sort of thing was the
Yes.
message that I was
Yes.
getting as a general, and that may start to change the dynamics potentially. I don't know, but it was an interesting thing. So because obviously in the small cell ecosystem, there's quite a big push to enabling neutral hosting, which is intrinsically it's a sharing architecture. Neutral hosts, they want to share. They want as many operators on their infrastructure as possible for their business model. So that's an interesting dynamic there, that regulatory and ministry push towards sharing, thinking about sharing from an early stage. Okay,
Yeah.
sorry, I interrupted your flow.
No, not at all. And it leads neatly to the next point, actually.
Yeah,
But I do agree, and I think some of these countries, I think Bahrain is particularly notable in that, as you say, the sort of the belief in shared infrastructure for accelerating progress is feeding through into regulation, not just telecom regulation, but
yeah,
also
yeah.
city regulation, which of course is vital. And I think we can see the effect because this is our forecast, the same forecast that we saw before, except broken down by who's the primary deployer of these units. And as in other markets, we believe that neutral host models, sharing models are vital to allow scale, to allow a diversity of service providers and stakeholders to take part. But we do see that this progressing quite significantly above the global average, or indeed, perhaps more interestingly, above the developed market average in terms of the growth of neutral host in this region. So this is a more positive picture for neutral host than most of Europe, for instance, for reasons that you just touched on, Simon. So we'll share all this data so if people want to drill down it in more detail. But we can see that neutral host is the biggest sort of growth in terms of deployment model. Private networks, industrial networks are a significant share, again, somewhat above global average because of some of the very big industries that are getting involved. We'll touch, I'm sure, on Saudi Aramco later.
Yeah.
So, and obviously the MNOs are often involved in these deployments. It's not that they're completely out of the picture, but they are certainly declining as the primary deployer for the reasons I think that we'll discuss further. But there are barriers, of course, and I think the forum's work and a lot of what was talked about at the event is about trying to lower these on a regional basis. The different colours relate back to those three types of deployment models, so MNO first, neutral host, and private or enterprise networks. And you can see, I won't go into huge detail because we've got lots to cover, but you can see that their concerns do vary. When we do the survey, we ask the deployers, what are your top barriers? The really big ones that certainly are particularly important to the neutral host, and therefore very important to lower if we're going to encourage this shared model, are just, of course, the cost of infrastructure and siting. They're more concerned about that because of the economics of neutral hosts, more concerned than any other stakeholders about TCO. They're concerned about how you share value and reward when there are very complex stakeholder relations, particularly perhaps in a city environment where many different parties have an interest in that network. And of course, scalability, both how do you really have a truly scalable network if it's got to support a whole array of different use cases, perhaps for different industries, and also a diverse range of environments, from venues to indoor and outdoor to density and so on. So these I think are, just for the context of what we're going to be talking about now, these are some of the key concerns that are seen in the region. The private enterprises obviously can be slightly different. I think their top concern is operational complexity, and they want these things to be simple, easy to run.
And I think that the scalability, I mean, this is an occupational hazard of the neutral host, isn't it? Because at the end of the day, they're being left with typically the difficult to reach and cover environments. I mean, at the end of the day,
yes,
the mobile operators can do the high power, high tower, and they have the exclusive ownership of spectrum, and that's fine. And it's I'm not saying their life is easy, but it's a well understood way to the deployment. But yeah, as soon as you start to get into a neutral host space where you're doing sharing and you're talking about in-building or metro or what in-building, outdoor, near in-building like coverage scenarios, this scalability of the solution and how much you can make bespoke versus a lift and shift model is a fundamental engineering challenge for the teams in neutral host operators. I mean, it's very much part of their challenge list for sure.
Absolutely. And I think why the concern that is of least a concern to neutral hosts compared to other stakeholders, monetization, because once they get past all those challenges, they know exactly how to monetize what they're building. That's a very established sort of model. Whereas, as you say, the issue is being able to scale and build out economically in order to monetize.
So there's, I mean, but ultimately, you could say a building is a building. I mean, obviously, I'm sure the dynamic of being encouraged to think about sharing, and you showed the slide that showed the neutral hosts are a demand driver here for sure, and they're learning about how to do a blueprint for deployments in different building types. We may find that this market in some building type areas becomes thought leading. It's quite possible, isn't it? It depends how their rollout plans for the different neutral host thinking business models. But yeah, okay, that's very interesting. Thanks, Caroline. So I think, is that your last slide? I believe.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that was.
I mean, really, I just wanted to do, as I say, as a forum, we're very lucky, fortunate to have two strong players in the Saudi market on our board, from ACES and Tawal, two well-known companies. Neutral host and tower like players, they both have a slightly different perspective, but that gives us a nice diversity of thinking into the board and the strategic thinking, that they've played a strong supporting role for the forum last year. But I think that really I just wanted to talk through some of the, as I say, those three areas that sort of build up to the forum, to the forums, setting up the SEWS in Saudi. We started our journey, and I think that you mentioned, actually, it wasn't a huge priority one on your list, Caroline, around spectrum and the regulatory barrier. It wasn't top on the concern list necessarily on your final slide, but our route into starting to dig into deeper dive into the Saudi thinking and the regional thinking came through our RPG, regulatory and policy group, expert group within the forum. And we were stimulated into action through a consultation that was issued by the CST, the regulator in Saudi. And there were some interesting points that came out there, which I think it's worth just dwelling on, because they're asking some very good questions, or they were asking some very good questions. The consultation is now closed. First point for me, and you haven't mentioned it in your slides, Caroline, but I think it does help in some markets to have these sort of statements, was a 2030 vision, which became in the first round of conversation with the regulatory perspective. They were clearly leaning into that as a driver for their consultation. But do you generally, if you start to get these all-inclusive visions for the tech sector, telecom sector, they generally do help to drive thinking. I think it's a good way to start to focus minds on a time frame, and they've got their 2030. Probably a good thing, Caroline, I guess, to
have those
drivers.
I think I do think, as I briefly touched on, I think one of the interesting things in this region is that most of the states do have quite advanced sort of digital frameworks and digital industrial agendas and so on. And as you say, then these more specific consultations are in that framework, so they don't just sit in a silo. I think they very much help to shape thinking, and we've seen that in some other countries as well, USA, UK, and it all helps to concentrate minds, and particularly importantly, the minds of companies, investment companies that may want to put money and funding into this.
Oh yes, totally right. And I think that a lot of that is, for me, because that became quite noticeable as in the run into the conference itself. But there is a national spectrum strategy that is under development there. So I think they clearly got some interesting thinking there, and the Vision 2030 sort of sets the focus. Maybe getting into the details here, but I did pick out on that consultation process the 5G and beyond messaging. So not just 5G, talking already about how to influence the play out on 6G, and have already identified 10 gigahertz worth of spectrum across the radio frequencies that they think they can offer into this space. So there's quite a substantial spectrum availability story here coming from this market, which is interesting. The other emphasis, Caroline, which I think it's always a hidden story. We've certainly done in the forum a little bit of thinking on this, is the cellular vehicle, getting cellular systems connected to vehicles, which we always seem to talk about. It doesn't necessarily get the headlines, but they've allocated some spectrum in the upper 5 gigahertz range. We know that there's some hot topic discussions around who's going to be owning that bit of spectrum, or the Wi-Fi versus mobile crowd talking about those bits of spectrum. So clearly some thinking there. I mean, do you see connected vehicles as an important driver in the next phase, or is it always going to be a bit part player? You didn't pick it out as a particular trend.
I think it's important within some of the industrial agendas that go on in this region. So I think Saudi Arabia, but particularly UAE in this region, I think has really driven connected vehicles, and you do see them actually in use. On even in public, but particularly for industrial use cases. So yes, I think for this region is a particular driver. And I think to your point more generally, I think we have to remember about sort of beyond 5G. I think we have to remember how generally the MENA region used to deploy new technology behind the lead countries. With 5G, not just in small cells, but in general, that was very much reversed. And the Gulf countries were very ahead and very advanced in their use cases. And as you say, they've been thinking, putting together spectrum policies all this time. So yes, I think the connected vehicles is one example of that, and drones, which I suppose is related, is another one.
Yeah,
They're ahead of the world on this, apart from China.
It's interesting. And the other thing I just wanted to note here, quite advanced question asking around dynamic spectrum access. So thinking, the consultation phase. So asking the question of the industrial players about the benefits and disbenefits of going down this route. But it's clear that the sharing of spectrum is already being seriously considered policy-wise in the regulator. And that started to come up a little bit in the conference, actually. So I'll move on there. But those were sort of three key points that I've noted from the thinking of the regulatory space, and they're clearly wanting to be in a position to lead the conversation. They did note in the concluding remarks on the consultation that there were inputs from 65 wireless players from 20 countries. So not just the local consultation. This was there was an international input, and obviously the SCF contributed. That interesting to see that fielding of comments from a global community, and that may indicate a mindset. I guess the area then that I want just to talk about a bit now is the context of the conference. As we ran into the conference in November, we partnered with a conference called Connected World first year, and as that sets the conference, the sort of context for the overall conference of 3,000 plus people who attended across both conferences. And there again, the 2030 agenda, which we've already talked about. But the other thing that I found very interesting, and I wonder whether this is a good driver for telecoms in general, but also for small cell, is a very large billions, hundreds of billions of dollar discussion around data center deployment investments, and partnered with that AI. And they had identified 3 locations from east to west across Saudi where they were going to locate these data centers, underpinned by subsea cable connectivity and obviously cable fiber connectivity within the country as well. That's in terms of the underpinning platforms, could be quite an interesting dynamic to see how that plays out around the connectivity agenda once you've got that underpinning. Other markets thinking in that way around how they drive the next generation of telecoms, Caroline? It seems to be quite a strong thread here in Saudi.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a very strong thread. Obviously with AI being the major driver, and while we might think that some of the focus on AI is overhyped at the minute, so some of this is not going to happen. But on the other hand, even if you break the current estimates down, take 1/3 of them, this is still globally billions and billions of dollars of investment going into infrastructure, which will have to be connected and will have to be highly distributed for some of the applications that the AI is supposed to be going to do. So I think a lot of quite dense localized connectivity will be essential.
And maybe just a side comment from me. I mean, to some extent, I was delighted to see the disruption to over the last few days. I know
absolutely.
If people held shares in certain companies, they may have felt the pain. But the reality was always going to be a generic architecture for AI processing in chips was never, never going to be the right direction. You have to have diversity in architectures. There's going to be small language models, large language models in the general AI space for the consumer markets. But for telecoms, there will have to be quite efficient and bespoke AI solutions,
Yes.
a generic
Yes, absolutely.
architecture to cover all the processing needs right the way from layer 7 down to layer 1 of the stack. It ain't going to happen. There's no way.
No, absolutely.
So it's about time there was a reality check in terms of the silicon conversation, at least the silicon, and then on top of that, the firmware and the applications. It's just got to be more. It's not going to be one size fits all.
No,
So
it absolutely can't be.
having a good AI capability and able to play with the different technologies, I think, is going to be essential for many markets to stay competitive, frankly.
Yes.
It's good.
And if we're thinking about going back to beyond 5G, if we're thinking about 6G being AI native, which seems to be one of the few things that everyone can agree on, but as you say, that will require a processing platform that's with lots of diversity in it, particularly for small cells. I'm not going to be putting those on giant GPUs at cell site.
Absolutely right. Yeah, the old perennial challenge for small cell power consumption, getting the power
Yes.
to the base station.
Exactly. AI just makes that
backhaul?
worse.
What's the transport connection back to the core, etc. is all going to be playing out and interesting there. So I think that, and the other thing, the context was well worth noting, and kudos to our board members, ACES, for this, was the newly launched Riyadh Metro and the neutral host platform deployed there in the transport system. So coming back a little bit to our connected vehicle agenda, you could see that they've invested heavily in the digital infrastructure to connect the metro and to have good quality connectivity there from day one. In London with our legacy metro system, we've had to retrofit stuff in, which has been fairly painful. But it's good to see connectivity from day one being part of the proposition in a new build metro, and that's the right way to do these things. So I think that just to then really, so having got that context, and a lot of that sort of came in the broader agenda of the connected world and SCWS build up, we then went into the SCWS itself. And just a few things I want to dwell on for a bit, Caroline, in the last 10 minutes or so before we open up for questions. For people listening in, there is a Q&A tab. If you want to type in questions, please do so. We'll get to them if we can. Best efforts as ever with these chats. But I just wanted to just think a little bit about the content that we were seeing. Just for the people listening in as well, there is a resources page that is available. I don't know whether someone in the back end, so to speak, on Teams is able to put that link into the chat for people. But on the Small Cell Forum website, you will see a resources page for the Saudi event, and a lot of the presentations are publicly available there. So be our guest and have a look at that. But I'm just going to pick out a few items that were interesting. The first thing that we wanted to pick up was this theme that you alighted on, Caroline, about getting a strong message from Saudi Arabia around the opportunity, and then trying to encourage the investors in. So, where are the investors into this emerging tech ecosystem? And we had a presentation from a chap called Mansour Hanif. Many on this call may know the name, senior leader in the EE rollout of 4G in the UK. Over the last few years, he's been over helping with the NEOM project, and now principally an investor position as an investor. But one of the things that was quite interesting, Caroline, to see was these sort of lighthouse projects or flagship projects and how they now they have been effective, or appear to me to be effective in galvanizing some direction of travel. So this concept of giga projects, giga connectivity, very high connectivity requirements, and how they are maybe setting the pace in terms of, some may argue that they're a little bit too futuristic, but this sort of augmented experience and connectivity, is that going to be a wide market? I know this is a wider discussion about how 6G is framed, but do we see still that augmented or mixed reality like experiences are going to be helping the small cell playbook?
I think they do, where they're a driver. Obviously, I think that there's been a little cooling of interest in it. There was all that metaverse hype, and then sort of people started to question it. But I think a more sort of realistic view of mixed reality is coming in, and we are starting to see some interesting applications. And I think you very much do see them in the context of these sort of big projects to next generation cities and so on. We see in this region.
They seem to galvanise some thinking. I think the other thing that's advantageous for the small cell ecosystem is ultimately, if you're so immersed in an experience, you're either indoor or you're low mobility, nomadic.
Yes.
Near in building. I'm not totally convinced that these experiences you're going to be seeing them enabled for the top of a dune in the middle of a remote location in Saudi Arabia. No. But perhaps in the dense environment in the cities, in Riyadh or whatever, maybe there are some interesting use cases and that will drive some of that thinking. So I mean, I think it's worth following that track.
And certainly in industries as well. Oil and gas industry, which obviously is a big one. They started to use a lot of mixed reality.
Yeah, the other one where we do see some quite interesting emerging use cases, and it's an area that's close to my heart personally, is a stadium connectivity. So we launched what we called a stadium connectivity forum, platform within our Small Cell World Summit series, and we'll carry that through into London. But actually, one of the highest attended sessions, and we had standing room only, and a lot of people on the stage as well. So it was a challenge for the chair to give them time. Was the stadium agenda? Very interesting to see and sound. And of course, soon after the conference, the formal announcement from FIFA around World Cup 2034. These big events, they really do drive some thinking around the high capacity connectivity experience, and well worth thinking that's going to be a driver of some innovative deployments, I would have thought.
Oh, absolutely, and I think we all know that stadiums and big venues are. They're one of the environments really where small cells, it's hard to argue with small cells. Wi-Fi doesn't really do it in those sort of environments, and there's such a huge requirement for and also some of your mixed reality applications start to really be important there. So this seems to be an enormous driver, especially as you say, given the big strategic focus that Saudi Arabia has on sports. Really becoming a sporting hub now.
Absolutely, and I think this is, and of course, when we talk about small cell, there's obviously a small cell product that most people will recognise, but we also talk about the small cell topology, which is inclusive of DAS architectures or hybrid architectures, which you can see are quite commonplace. So we certainly don't exclude DAS from the deployment, the in-building solution story. It's in the toolkit, absolutely, well placed in some of the different stadium deployments and in building. The other thing that I was very encouraged by, so there's quite some forward thinking. The CST, again, the regulator, they were working with Nokia and ACES on a in-building system solution proof of concept activity, looking at total cost of ownership and enforcing into the deployment as part of the variables Open RAN architecture and MOCN. So making an architecture that is, because we've sort of dwelled in the forum, we said, well, more RAN, multi-operator RAN versus MOCN, multi-operator core network. Like, these architectures are out there and they're in the toolkit. But I think broadly, generally, the forum is, saying, let's move on to MOCN, guys. We've been dancing around MOCN versus MORAN for 10 years.
Yes.
But actually, they were forcing the regulator was forcing a MOCN conversation in the neutral host.
Yes.
And I thought that was quite encouraging to see that, forward thinking, and hopefully that will, for that market, it will help to resolve. Do we see that we're now moving into a MOCN era, Caroline, or do you think we're still dancing around this MORAN MOCN discussion in various markets?
I think it varies a lot by market. I think the majority of markets are still dancing, still trying to work it out, and how it plays is more driven by the individual operators and stakeholders. But I think some kind of regulatory leadership on this does really help.
It does help,
but I think it's still relatively rare.
Yeah. The other area that I picked up just a bit before we move into the Q&A, and I think it's well worth us dwelling on this one, Aramco Digital investment. And you mentioned it. This dynamic in this market is very interesting. So the regulator has, allocated Aramco Digital with a 450 meg spectrum. And they're creating to me, it's a total industrially oriented network for private network like scenarios. Very, very aggressive intervention into the market to say, we want this player to be addressing this segment. Different perhaps from other markets where there's been a lot of discussion in the 5G standardization around slicing and saying, oh, we could just use the public operator network and slice a bit off for the industrial sectors to use. Different mindset in here emerging. And that could be quite an interesting dynamic to say, no, let's focus on build a network out. Here's a bit of spectrum for you, 450, it's nice for coverage, capacity oriented, you can put some small cells if you need to get the capacity up or whatever, but that's an interesting development.
Yeah, it's hugely interesting. And I think, well, obviously a company like Aramco certainly knows how to build out infrastructure at scale. And so giving them some spectrum is really interesting because, as you say, we've always talked about these slice networks, and this looks very similar to the model that, say, Dish has been talking about doing in the United States, but they're still an operator, but using all the new technologies in new spectrum to provide an industrial network that can be sliced up for all kinds of different users. To have another industry, not a telecom industry, doing this is extremely interesting, and I think the difference between that and an operator doing it is it's their primary focus. As we know, telecom operators always have other priorities, and so these industrial networks can get left behind unless there's an immediate demand. Whereas this is being set up from scratch to service the demand. So yeah, extremely interesting, that one, and could be a template for other countries that have a similar big infrastructure company that's willing to take on that role.
Absolutely right, and it's that which has always been. I know the US has been looking at 400 meg areas for a while, and different markets have different views, but you can see the 450 area in the telecoms supply chain. The vendors are quite keenly pushing this in a number of different sectors now, and the fact that Saudi's actually made some fairly big investment decisions here, it could put them in quite an influential global view in terms of the learnings. Okay, so there's sort of key points I picked up, and I'd say for those who are viewing, if you want to extract some value from the resources, please be our guest. You can send questions to the forum if you want to follow up on any of the presentations you can see there. I wanted to pick out some key points from the contents that will likely inform our thinking about our next event in Saudi. We're moving into some Q&A. And what we do for these sessions is, for the forum members, we give them a chance to flag some questions that they like us to think about. That we have an open forum here, but I will dwell on some questions that have come in from our member ACES. Thank you to the team there for flagging some questions. There's a lot of questions, so I'm just going to pick out a few, Caroline, just for us to mull over for a little bit. I'm wondering whether we can just, because Open RAN is a constant debating point in the industry. Actually, if we just pick out this one, is Open RAN, what are we seeing around the importance of collaboration among the telecom operators and the Open RAN vendor community? And here, importantly, to zoom in on the small cell solution space, do we see that the telecom operators are so influential? I'm just wondering now, with the narrative that's coming out of the Saudi place, that perhaps it's actually the neutral hosts that are the key dynamic rather than the telecom operator, the traditional telecom operators with their public mobile networks. I wonder whether there is a trade-off now to be thinking about. Is the Open RAN trailblazing happening in the neutral host space, potentially around small cell, rather than worrying about, I don't know, it's interesting question to start to think about that.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. I'm not sure it's terribly visible yet because Open RAN's been so slow, but I think there's a logic to that, because I tend to believe that if the conventional telecom operators drive Open RAN forward, they will, in the end, they won't really work with a big diversity of vendors. They like the idea, but I think we'll still see the incumbent vendors being the major partners for all kinds of reasons. But I think if new companies come into the market, then they will look for different relationships, they'll have different priorities, and perhaps they'll want to have an influence that they wouldn't have working with the very largest vendors. So I think for Open RAN to be as small cell Open RAN, to be as diverse and multi-vendor as people would like it to be, it does need other stakeholders who will actively work with different partners. So yes, there's a logic to it. I'm not sure if it's happening yet, but
no, I guess you're starting to
drive it.
Yeah, it's starting to see. I get that CST trial where it was,
yes,
it's ACES as a neutral host for an in-building solution with working with Nokia and the regulator. They're clearly trying to pump up that opportunity for collaboration. And it's a constant story within the forum to encourage diversity in terms of vendors and solutions there, because of this challenge around the different built environments that the deployments need to address.
Yes.
You need that, don't you? So it's an area where I think it's always going to be useful. And I guess the other thing that I would just point out for those who are not aware, neutral host companies in Saudi Arabia are actually, it's not unusual to see that they have an R&D division, and they are developing from scratch, with the help of the global supply chain and the expertise that's available in the Open RAN ecosystem. They are actually developing their own in-house small cells. That was something that came through in the presentation from ACES, for example, at the event. They were showcasing on their stand a small cell that they had developed in partnership with the global supply chain. They developed it themselves. They own, they own some of the IP within that base station. That's interesting and something to be encouraged from my perspective, from the forum, to have more makers of these systems available on a global level. Seems sensible way to go.
Definitely, and I think we obviously see various countries that want to develop a homegrown vendor community and platform, India being the big example. But that's much easier usually to achieve first and small cells rather than trying to build a big base station from scratch with local supply.
Totally, it's a good learning ground actually, in terms of you've got the full stack there. You do need to implement a base station. It's a cellular base station, but it's necessarily reduced in capacity, and some of those real hard engineering challenges around getting the capacity up in the macro architecture. You can to some extent circumvent them, although of course there are other pressures there around the product engineering. And the form factors and other things, but it's an interesting, good learning ground actually.
Absolutely.
And I think that this is, maybe I just want to pick up this question because it's got a nice one from Aces that just is encouraging the thought process around saying, where can lessons be learned from other markets? So Saudi's going to become a hub for activity. That's their aspiration, their ambition. And now, there's a global perspective. There's very much, that was the agenda of the conference, and the connected world was all much about saying this is a shop window. We want to engage in the global ecosystem. So, I mean, there's a question here about what lessons can be learned from other regions that have successfully implemented small cell, and how can they be fed through into the MENA markets? What's your thought there? Are there some markets are a little bit ahead that can, is well worth MENA engaging with and collaborating with?
I think so. I suppose the obvious one is China, and obviously MENA has not broken the ties with China in the same way that some other regions have. So I think there's still a lot of communication and influence going on there, and I think you can see a lot of parallels between what China has tried to do in things like city projects and connected vehicles and industrial agendas using small cell networks. That would certainly provide learnings into MENA, and probably back in the other direction as well.
The other market, the obvious one. Yeah, the other market, Caroline, that I would pick out was India. I mean, that there was
for sure.
Our membership. We have Reliance, Radisys as members, and they were very engaged in the conference and clearly assisting from a technology platform perspective.
Yes.
Not so much hardware, perhaps, but certainly the software and system integrator thinking. So you can see India to India market, and there's actually with the locations of the countries, relative locations, you could see quite a lot of synergy, but perhaps in terms of the subsea cabling across from India to Saudi and the peninsula. And the data center thinking, so not just around the small cell, but a much wider story happening there, developing.
I'd also pick out Turkey, which we don't include in Middle East. Some people put it in Middle East region, we put it in Europe, but obviously it can be either. But the figures I showed don't include Turkey. But I think given that there's geographical proximity, and Turkey is another country that's trying to build its own in-house ecosystem, has a lot of industrial projects and so on. So I think that's also another one where there could be a two-way exchange of knowledge.
The one question I got two questions we'll just pick up quickly in the final one more from Aces, and then we'll go to the one that's come through on the chat. The observation here on standardization and the importance of it. It was a good point. There was a point well made here that perhaps there's not quite the same culture of globalized standards or regional standards setting in the Middle East that there is in, say, you take Europe, for example, with the ETSI structure and a long tradition of trying to align standards to scale the market. And maybe the Middle East is a little bit fragmented in their thinking about standards, and which one I certainly felt some tension around. Are we going to do Wi-Fi here? Are we going to do the mobile thinking here? And maybe they would benefit from a little bit more coordination around cross-border standards.
Yeah.
to scale the market. I didn't really pick that up in your. I guess you did have it as one of the barriers was the regulatory thing, but is there a standard? Getting the standards, the regulators to align cross-border can only be a help to the region.
Absolutely, I think so, and I think a lot of it is because this region is so diverse. And obviously, the GCC has a lot of standard common thinking, but really the North African bit of MENA is really quite a different world, and they have different concerns. So yes, I think whereas you could say that Western Europe, even though all the countries are different, has a lot of common purpose, I'm not sure that's nearly as true of the MENA region, even though it's geographically smaller.
Yeah. So now this is actually an SCF policy question, so you may want to stay quiet on this one. It's just a pointed question. But for DAS, which, as I said, we're inclusive of, we're very much don't exclude that as an evolving architecture. What's the forum's view on the current vendors? So 2 vendors have been name checked there, the usual suspects, and whether they're supporting open interfaces to drive DAS instead of RF input related architectures. So, okay. I will say that, as I say, the forum we have members who have a portfolio of products that are inclusive of small cell and DAS. And increasingly within the forum, we do architecture work and think about deployments that are hybrid DAS. We have specialist players. I can think of at least 2 startup companies that are US based who look at very much. One of the companies on name check, Edge Nectar, who are quite comfortable with putting a core to create a private network slice on a DAS architecture. So we're very much up for the opening of the DAS deployments and opening interfaces and creating hybrid network solutions that work from a total cost of ownership perspective. Hopefully that gives you a feel that we're very much inclusive of DAS. So that's not an architecture that we fear or say is declining. It's just part of the overall toolkit. Okay, thanks, Caroline. I'm going to draw a line there and say thank you very much for your time and your input, as ever, very useful. Just as a closing remark, everyone, for people who are on the call, happy always to hear from you on chat or in emails to the forum, to the info email around topics you'd like us to cover in these chats. There will be another webinar coming along. I'm not in a position today to say what it was. Please do consider becoming a member of the forum. Contact us through the website. A lot of interesting architecture and deployment studies are ongoing. And just to say, for any of you who have an open question in your mind, yes, the forum will be doing a SCWS in Saudi again. Stand ready for the announcement as to the dates and the arrangements, but we're certainly planning to revisit the Saudi market and to do a further SCWS there. It's a very interesting market, and as we've discussed today, hopefully you've got a good impression on that, as it's got great potential. All right, thanks, Caroline, for your time again.
Thank you. Thanks, Simon.
Look forward to our next webinar, and thank you everyone for joining.